Okay, so thanks everyone for joining this webinar today. My name is Stephanie from Chapter 0 Brussels, and I'm really happy to be organizing this webinar on a very critical topic for our members today, together with Chapter 0 in the UK and also in France as well. So we're really happy to have you all here. And for those of you that are able to join us, thanks a lot. So we are here to talk about the people side of climate action and the role of the board. And for those of you joining that are our members, you know Chapter 0 is the Directors Climate Forum, so really a place to discuss and to meet together to talk about climate change. And we are really happy to welcome everyone to this. So I wanted to welcome our members and also maybe give the chance to Dean to say a few words. We are here together with Chapter 0 in the UK and France organizing this webinar. So maybe Dean, you want to say a few things?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I'll keep it short and then we can get into the real reason why we're all here. So I'm Dean Cambridge, Head of Programs at Chapter 0 UK. And our focus globally, but especially in the UK this year, is about supporting our 2,500 members deliver credible and just transitions to net zero. And we know this simply isn't going to be possible without people. And people are going to drive the transition from the heart of business, and boards need to be ready to unlock that people power over this year if we're going to deliver ambitious climate action. So huge thanks to Korn, Ferry and all of our panelists today for lending us their expertise on this very important topic. So very much looking forward to it. And back to you, Stephanie.
Thanks a lot, everyone. And we'll hand over directly to the Korn Ferry team. And again, big thanks from my side as well to you all, and also to our panelists. As Dean mentioned, we appreciate you giving this the time. So we'll hand over to you to take us through this very critical topic. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Dean. So good morning, good afternoon. We have people joining us today from various locations. So welcome to you all. Very pleased to have you with us today for this webinar in which we'll explore the people side of climate action and the role of the boards. From our side also, I would like to start by thanking Chapter 0 for helping us organize this session together with us here at Korn Ferry, and special thanks to Stephanie, Dean, and also Marie-Hélène in France. Are we sharing the slides? Oh, Enrique? Yeah, okay. Can we switch to the next slide, please? All right. So quick introductions from the Korn Ferry side. I'm joined today by my colleagues Olivier Dupré and Mark Lancelot, and we are part of Korn Ferry's ESG and sustainability practice. And as an introduction to Korn Ferry, we are a global people and organizational consulting firm working with our clients around the people side of their strategic business challenges. And we see how sustainability and climate action in particular is changing the way we do business. More and more organizations have their net zero targets in place, and their stakeholders are now expecting clear and meaningful climate action and progress and today. But delivering to climate action targets requires transformative change over a long time. And it actually requires that we make sustainability sustainable. We really see how organizations today put many efforts in the techno-economical aspects of decarbonization and climate action in net zero roadmaps and targets, but the people aspects in the implementation need to be looked at simultaneously. And we believe that people will make the difference in climate action, and that successfully managing the people aspects will be at the heart of successful implementation and transformation. And this is what Olivier, Mark, and I will talk about today. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, we will explore the key people challenges in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We'll discuss the role of the board in helping address these challenges, and we will provide practical guidance for board members to engage the executives along the way. And we will be presenting insights from our research in the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer, in our leadership models for sustainability, and in the implications for the operating model and people agenda across the whole organization. And we'll do this with our panelists, who will bring real-life cases and share some of their own experiences being part of the executive office and the board. So big welcome to Magali Anderson, James Cameron, and Una Harper. Very pleased to have you with us today, and we really look forward to the insights you will bring us later on. Just before we really get started, a reminder that this webinar is recorded. It's going to be made available to you via Chapter 0. You can ask questions through the Q&A or the chat box throughout the webinar. And we have also foreseen some time at the end of this session to answer some of the questions raised in the chat box and the Q&A. And we'll also make a consolidated Q&A sheet available after the webinar. So what do we actually mean by the people side of climate action? Well, we believe that organizations need to answer 5 people-related questions if they are to turn their climate intent into action. And the first one is purpose. To be really clear on why climate action is important to you and why you are doing this. Second is leadership and talent. What kind of leadership, talent, competencies, and skills do we need to deliver to our climate action ambitions? And how will we attract and retain these? Third is culture and mindset. How do we reinforce the right behaviors and mindsets across the organization? And then there's governance. How does our board need to evolve to oversee climate action strategy? And 5 is operating structure. How do we organize to deliver our climate action and sustainability ambitions? So 5 people-related questions and that are important to look at, and we will touch upon all of these questions today, but with a specific focus on leadership and talent and operating structure. But first, purpose. We really see today how some of the largest companies worldwide in high carbon footprint industries like steel, cement, fertilizer, logistics are shifting values and purpose to create shared value for all stakeholders, for people and planet beyond profit. And they are doing this because the future for them is sustainability and climate action leadership. And so they ingrain climate and planet in their purpose as a critical driver of their transformation. They know that sustainability requires their business to transform and that comes with a new organizational purpose. And they are committed to becoming part of the solution. They're also doing this because they know that purpose-driven organizations are more successful. The next slide, please, Enrique. So more and more of our research shows the impact on business results of sustainability and climate action strategies that are anchored in purpose. And there's also increasing demand from employees to work for companies that are creating a better future, especially, but not just millennials and Gen Z. We really see also in our recruitment practice here in Korn Ferry, how the talent brand and the employer value proposition of these companies has changed. Some were seen as not so attractive businesses, often part of what was called the problem, but they have altered their talent brand and have become attractive to people who want to join them to help address climate change and make a difference. But these companies can only achieve this through being really clear about how they anchor climate in purpose and strategy, and then put relentless effort in delivering to their promise. So the message here is to not just look at climate action targets and metrics, but to also be very clear about why climate is important to you and why you are doing this. What is the value you create for the business, for the planet, for employees, and for all other stakeholders? And then work with your people to bring them along, inspiring and empowering them around that common goal. So this is purpose. Olivier, over to you for leadership and culture.
Thank you, Nico. Leadership and culture, we've regrouped these two because at the end of the day, leadership is really about changing behaviors and role modeling these behaviors. And culture is achieving this at scale, at the company scale. So we thought that would be a nice to have them put together. when we talk about leadership, so the first that comes to mind is really the Chief Sustainability Officer. They're now clearly instrumental in the climate action, but their role very much depends on the maturity of the company. It depends as well on the sector-specific focus areas. And finally, there is this element of the personal background of the person involved as a Chief Sustainability Officer. And all that actually conditions the type of setup we can see across the board in companies. So you've got a few of these figures. It's all about relationship at the end of the day. And what matters most for the CSO is her or his ability to engage with the C-suite and in particular with the CEO. But today we still see that it's not the majority that are directly reporting to CEO as yet, but it's something that is continuously rising, and we can see that with the numbers. It tends to be more the case with larger companies and less so with smaller companies. But what matters again is the connection, the relationship, and the good news is that 70% of CSO as of early last year literally engage with their CEO once a month at the very least. So that gives a kind of a pace for climate action. Now, why are these setups so varied across the board? Again, it's linked to these three elements, but we can see therefore reporting as either to the CEO directly or to CHRO, to CFOs, to CMOs. I mean, there are literally every single options that we can see on the table. Again, there is no right or wrong setup. In our opinion, it's really a matter of a capacity for influence, and there are probably limitations when it's too far removed, remote from the C-suite, obviously. So we would expect the reporting, the direct line to the CEO to really increase and be the dominant model. And we see sometimes the question, do we need a CSO at all? And yes, we do. We do believe that. And the role is changing as the maturity and the journey evolves, obviously, but we will always need champions for what is at stake. So in our opinion, CSO are not going to disappear anytime soon. So, finally, we see a further split sometimes, and sometimes really with two people for the jobs, between the two dimensions of external facing, which we call here the figurehead CSO. In that case, the main thrust of the role is really about communicating, engaging multiple stakeholders, representing the company, participating into the ecosystem and the wider discussions about climate action. But we see as well, and more so, and it's actually quite critical to the transformation, people focusing really daily on the delivery of the climate action and the transformation that is required. And we've called that the transformation officer. Now, these two roles are most of the time really done by the same leader. And that can explain how tricky and challenging these roles are. But now we see some companies splitting the roles. So at the end of the day, what matters for the board and the executive committee is to really have this discussion about the best setup for the company at this moment in time. And that's really, again, a mixture of sector-specific, of focus areas, and of maturity in the journey. Now, in terms of role, and let's say what the insider's view of what a CSO role is like, and how success is driven in a way. So we all know it's really about engaging first in a radical collaboration. That's a new fashionable word, but it really says what it is. It's collaborating like never before, much beyond the company's boundaries, and engaging with the whole value chain, various ecosystems. And it's always to do so on very complicated issues indeed. And they are what we call intricate or wicked problems, as you know, but it's really, they're all high stakes because all our future depends on them, not just the company's future, but they tend to be above average complicated because they're systemic in nature. So decarbonization and the scope 3 in particular being one, circularity, which is the other half of climate action, is another one. Water, biodiversity now more and more on the table and on the board's table as well. So the ability for CSO to deal with this complexity, the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the difficulty to anticipate what's coming next in a context and in a world which is very complicated, that's really critical to their role and to who they are. We spoke already about this influence role as well in the capacity to really mobilize, be a catalyst for change for a wider network of stakeholders, but of partners as well. No one can win alone anymore in the sustainability endgame, and we all need to engage people that we have to rely upon for what we don't control anymore. Another trait which is important is the capacity to deliver results, obviously, but it's now and in the long run, because we need short-term achievements. We have short-term milestones, and we all know that there are a longer run actually perspective on that, especially on climate. Finally, system thinking, that was really, if not used yet as an expression, was really underpinning everything that we've discussed so far, is really establishing and understanding all the connected dimensions of our issues and journeys and transformation. And for that, you definitely need, as a CSO, to keep a very open and curious mind. You need to learn continuously, basically, but to accept as well different perspectives. And finally, you can't achieve that kind of challenge if you don't like it, basically, and if you don't have in you the capacity to grow further. So there is an element as well of being energized by the difficulty. Now, leadership is not just the remit of the CSO, but it's important to understand that what really drives the CSO can be actually leveraged further to define a new type of leadership, and that's what's coming next. Here, we would like to focus, the top part of the chart is really, at the end of the day, what we do, and that shapes us all as leaders. So it's really a mixture of competencies, so things you know how to do, and experiences, things you've done before, and that have shaped more or less your capabilities. But more important, we would like to focus today on two maybe let's say, less known aspects, which we believe are actually quite important, especially for these roles. So personality traits, they are really who you are at the end of the day, and what motivates you. So the motivation drivers, which are very important for CSOs. And you'll find, again, some of the words we've used already, but it's quite important that in terms of deep personality, the CSO actually likes, in a way, and is able, or she's able, to build relationship and enjoy this interaction. There is an element of self-awareness which conditions further learning and growing, which is important. The fact that change is inevitable and we have to thrive on that is really, we have to enjoy actually this impermanence of things. Curiosity and intellectual curiosity in particular is important. We have all reached now our limits in terms of understanding the complexity and the intricacy of sustainability at large and climate action in particular. So we need to learn from others, and we can't be knowledgeable at everything, but we need to be aware at the very minimum, and that calls for curiosity. So in terms of then really drivers, sustainability and the CSO role in particular is not just like another job. That's the main difference. And sustainability transformation is the end game. It's not a mean to an end. It is the end that we want to achieve. So therefore, it has to be really core to their identity and purpose on a personal basis. And this sincerity, this passion is what probably will help them lead and make others people aware and embarked. So this energy comes from facing these challenges. We've said that before. And then another aspect which is important is that make it tangible, make it concrete, deliver on that. So operationalize in a way the sustainability agenda. And it's a big expectation, and it's now probably one of the top on the agenda of any CSO nowadays, is really making it stick, making it deliver, making it last, is rebuilding processes, structures, and teams that actually achieve the expected outcomes. And finally, and maybe one of the most important, CSO is an important role. They are top leaders, most of them in their own setup, but they're not in there to have the power. They are not in any thirst of recognition. What they want is really a collective success. And that's quite important as a personality driver as well. So ego is probably second, and achieving a collective success comes first. So that's our take of what makes a CSO successful. It's actually correlated in our database to above average performance. So this is from research. Now, as I said earlier, the CSO is one element of the puzzle, but we need actually to embark all leaders into this sustainability agenda. But a lot of what we've said actually defines a new breed of leaders, and they're already there. We consider today maybe 14% of any leader demonstrate regularly these traits we were mentioning. So it's not a lot, but it's already a good starting point. But we need more in the future to achieve climate action. So we call them enterprise leaders because they have to create value really literally across the whole enterprise and for a broad range of stakeholders. And it's very different from the former old command and control vertical leadership that we had, which was defined within a company and did not really to engage in a broader fashion outside the financial analyst. Here we're talking really something which is across literally everything we can think of. And that element of being across is actually reconciling all the time things which tend to be opposite or a paradox, let's say. And one good example of that in terms of the delivery is the paradox between perform and transform. And that's really what defines these leaders the best. And you see the quote on the right-hand side of the slide, but it's really like flying a plane that you have not yet even finished to build totally. And that's what we expect from these leaders to do with their own companies. They have to perform every day and yet transform the model at which they were probably successful initially. And that goes across what we call here, to modelize it a bit, visualize, realize, mobilize, and catalyze, which are other words to say basically from the very purpose and vision to the definition of a strategy, its implementation, the first achievement and the need to deliver, but as well the catalyst for change and the ability to embark others in a more deep transformation, in a deeper transformation, so to speak. So that's what we see as enterprise leaders, and that's who we need actually to drive climate action. Now, in their own words, and that's quite interesting from a set of interviews we had last year. Enrique, if you don't mind moving to the next, sorry. Yeah. This is how the leaders themselves describe what at the end of the day describe themselves and the traits that are really characteristic to their success. And you can see it's very, very coherent with whatever our research told us in the first place. So that's the good news as well. So there is that element of entrepreneurial, because you've got to create something new that no one has ever done before. And you've got to create it with others, basically. This enthusiasm that is the fuel at the end of the day of the energy that we need. And if you're not optimistic with a positive outlook on anything, you can't succeed, because we have bad news literally every day on that as well. Courageous, because it's difficult. Any way you define difficulty is there. So if you don't have that personal courage, you can't overcome the hurdles, basically. Collaborative, can't be stressed too much. it's collaborative at a scale that none of us has literally experienced so far. So it's really maybe the biggest challenge of them all from a human side of things. Humble humility, I think we've said that. Inclusion, of course, because we need to actually enjoy the diversity of perspectives on that, but still be able to embark everyone into the job that's to be done. And system thinking, I won't elaborate again. It's clear to everyone what we mean by that. So then if we move to culture, and as I said, culture at the end of the day is having achieved all or part of what we described in terms of change of behaviors from a leadership perspective, except that it's now company-wide, if not even wider in terms of value chain or ecosystem. And culture, successful culture, is having really changed behaviors at scale. And here again, our research between, let's say, the most advanced and mature and successful sustainable companies from ratings, basically, if we compare that to the lagging behind or the companies who have not yet totally started their journey, the 10 main characteristics are here that differentiate the two sets of companies. So, and it's very coherent again. It's, I think, quite good news, but it reinforces the message of today. So you'll find, the human side in everything, literally. So that bias toward action, because it's all about delivering, the capacity to convince and influence others. Autonomy and empowerment, that's really important, because at the end of the day, it has to run through the depth of the organization. It's not just a challenge for the board and the executives. It's, of course, mobilizing everyone. Courage again, global perspective, and by global, we mean literally across again. So it's not just countries for transnationals, it can be jurisdictions from a regulatory standpoint, but it can be business units or business silos even. It can be across the boundaries of the company, etc. So the global understanding of the system level is important. The ability to deliver on different sets of results. So of course, the financial and economical performance, and all what sustainability now embodies, which is a massive amount of different achievements, be it water, biodiversity, carbon, and climate action actually intersects all of that, and circularity. This capacity to be energized by the difficulty, again, we've mentioned that, the resilience, we've mentioned that. Enjoying stretch objectives, I mean, it's difficult, but it has to be delivered. It's a big stretch, and it goes from an individual, a team, a company, and wider again. And finally, and maybe more interesting as well, because transformation of that nature, maybe the biggest we ever had to face, is really a journey, and a long one as such. We need to measure progress all the time, and therefore we need to value and provide continuous feedback to everyone involved. And that, again, is something that we need to consciously do in our systems, in our structures, in our rewards. And I think now we can move to another aspect, the harder part of things, and that's Mark Lancelot.
Thank you, Olivier. I'm now going to cover the topics of governance and operating structure. I'll be relatively brief on governance, but spend more time looking at operating model and structure implications. So we looked at a set of market leaders across a range of industries to see what practices they've adopted for board governance. You can see some of the companies we looked at on the slide here, such as Maersk, Microsoft, and Unilever. And the headline conclusion was that we see leading companies increasingly integrating climate action into the governance mechanisms of the board, though that is predominantly as part of the sustainability topic. So it's within that rather than being a separate topic. So there's 4 observations we wanted to highlight. Firstly, we see an increased frequency and rigor of reviewing sustainability and climate action within that, looking at plans and progress. And this is really reflecting the importance of climate action and a recognition of the complexity and sensitivity in making progress, hence the desire for increased visibility and scrutiny at the board level. So, for example, we can see that AstraZeneca, AP Moller and Engie reviewing their sustainability plans on a quarterly basis. Secondly, we see some instances of new board committees being created, focused on sustainability and climate within that. So beyond the traditional committees such as audit, remuneration and nominations. Examples here would be Microsoft, who have an environmental, social and public policy committee to the board that oversees the company's key non-financial regulatory risks that will have an impact on the company, and a key focus on its ability to sustain trust with customers, employees and the public. Another example would be Nestlé and their sustainability committee, which reviews the sustainability agenda and the measures they're using to ensure sustainability. Point 3 here really builds on the previous point. So we also saw some instances where there was full integration of sustainability and climate into the current board practices. So rather than being positioned in a separate committee, it sat at the board level and in the existing committees, so it's audit and remuneration, etc. Examples here would be GE, where their board oversees the execution of its sustainability strategy, and also Descartes. And lastly, we see this continued and increasing focus on ensuring that the board has the knowledge and skills to effectively look at the sustainability and climate agenda. Now, that won't be a surprise to any of you on the call today, given your board roles and your interest in the topic. The examples here we could see with Unilever, 7 out of the 11 board members have experience of purposeful business and sustainability, and a similar ratio at Holcim, having ESG expertise. And if we looked at HSBC, we see there's an ongoing continuous development on ESG to the board members there. So that's a brief overview of what we're seeing regarding climate action at the board. So it's increasingly visible, but usually as part of the sustainability or ESG remit. We do see sort of steercos and committees focused on decarbonisation, but they are at the executive committee level and subcommittees to those. That's where we're seeing that happen. So I'm now going to move on to the topic of operating structure. Consider the importance of context, offer a point of view on the implications for individual functions within the operating structure, and then give you some practical guidance and questions we think you can use when you're working with executive teams. So the first point here is the idea that context is key. So when we start to think about how to organise, how to structure, we have to remember that form follows function. So when we consider decarbonisation, we need to recognise that the nature of the decarbonisation challenge differs by sector and differs by position in the value chain. And then the business model response, which again might be different, also has implications for how to organise the operating work, and also to fit in with the prevailing operating structure of the business, so how centralised or decentralised it might be, for example. So in businesses focused on raw materials and component production, which are highly energy intensive, such as cement or steel or mining, the decarbonisation challenge here is primarily within the boundary of the business, so in scope 1 and 2. The challenge then is how to transform its operational activity, whether that's extraction or production processes, and will likely be dependent on new technologies and capital equipment and new processes. Whereas for businesses focused on making final products, the emissions footprint and decarbonisation challenge is primarily outside of the organisation boundary, either upstream or downstream. So for example, in food, that would be in agriculture. If you're making domestic appliances that consume energy and water, it's in the use phase and potentially the end of life phase. So the transformation challenge then is about how to source better, how to help the supply chain decarbonize, how to design products with a lower footprint in production and in the use phase and end of life, and how to engage and help customers better manage that use and end of life phase. Now, businesses may also consider new business models that can help enable low emissions, which might be pay for performance, take back, service models, circular models, and these additionally require changes to the operating model. So what capabilities does the business need and how should they be organised? So the key thought here of the slide is that the nature of the decarbonisation challenge depends on the sector, on where the business sits in the value chain, on the business's strategic response and new business models, and then the prevailing operating structure. And all of those set the agenda for what the right operating capabilities are and how to organise and structure those to drive climate action. So let's look at the implications at a functional level. What does climate action mean for business for each function? As I think one of the questions alluded to in the Q&A, transformation, sustainability and climate action touches all functions of the business. It's not just about the sustainability department, and it's not just about science and engineering for renewables. It requires new and enhanced capability, so people and skills and knowledge to carry out new activities. So this diagram here talks about the high-level implications across 6 key functional areas. I'm going to pick out 3 of those to talk to. So firstly, if we start with finance, that's going to mean new activities and skills in carbon accounting and non-financial reporting. There's going to be a need to understand the evolving regulatory agenda and emerging standards, so things like CSRD in the EU, the GHG protocol, science-based target initiative, the kind of emerging ISSB standards. If we think about climate risk and TCFD, that's going to require capabilities to carry out scenario modelling and climate risk quantification. Listed businesses may need skills in how to engage the market to secure funding through vehicles like green bonds and sustainability linked loans. And lastly, we can think about how to embed climate impact and carbon emissions in budget and investment appraisal. That might take the form of something like an internal carbon tax. So again, there's capability and skills and knowledge to operate mechanisms such as that. If we turn to operations, there could be a significant agenda here to understand, to plan, to deploy, to operate new production approaches and technologies. That could be tied to changing energy sources, so shifting from gas to electric or from gas to hydrogen. There could be an increased focus on heat recovery, or it could be about significant process redesign. So that's going to require new capabilities, new roles, new skills and knowledge, different types of engineering and science capabilities, and then management skills across the whole operation management life cycle. And many businesses are going to have to manage a significant transition period as they move from one set of operational practices to a new one, whilst continuing to operate or produce. So there will be a need to manage that transition. We've seen some of our clients now have a significant demand for technical project management over the next few years to be able to plan and integrate new equipment and manage that switchover. And lastly here, if we think about the circularity example that Olivier mentioned, remembering that circularity is a critical role in getting to net zero. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation research showed that only 55% of the way to net zero was through switch to renewables. The other 45% would be through changing extraction, production and consumption patterns. So there's circularity business models. So if businesses are moving to these new types of models where You might be doing take back, refurbishment, pay for performance, product as a service. There's new operational capabilities needed. So you need to think about things like reverse logistics, inspection, repair, refurbishment, parts and inventory management. So again, some critical capabilities to think about going forward. And lastly, if we look at sales and marketing and focusing a bit into the sales lens, so there'll be a need for enhanced insight into customer needs and the ability to design value propositions, either to meet changing expectations around the carbon footprint of products, or even to help customers in their own decarbonisation journeys. We see that decarbonisation often requires greater collaboration across the value chain, and that can mean more complex selling processes with more stakeholders. So there's a need to think about the sales force capabilities to manage those types of opportunities and sell in that way. And then if we think about service or solution selling, again, there's changes to sales force capability. So how do you almost like solution sell, design the right solution for a customer, think about pricing and profitability potentially over a service contract, and be able to manage profitability and risk over that contract or product lifetime. So those are some examples of the kind of harder technical skills and capabilities, but it's not just about those. There's also, given we're looking at transformation, there's a need to look at soft skills to take action. So the left-hand side here, we've called out some of those skills. I'm just going to run through those quickly, given some of the content that Olivier talked about. But there's this need for adaptability, recognising the changing working practices and innovation agenda, the need for resilience, so how to kind of cope and adapt through the change process, particularly recognising that there's uncertainty, we mightn't get everything right first time. And perspectives, so how to openly communicate, empathize, build trusting relationships, and be able to solve complex problems that require multiple perspectives. So that's a view of capability changes by function. The last piece I want to talk to is really what we hope is some practical guidance for you. So Nico alluded to this at the start. So we've developed a set of key questions that you as board members can use to ask of your executive officers. They're focused on the people agenda and specific to those roles. So there's 4 of these today that I'll talk through. So if we turn to the CFO first, what investment do we need over the next 5 years to reskill our workforce? What will our future workforce cost to run? Secondly, how are we building competence across the enterprise to factor in carbon emissions in investment and budget appraisal processes and decisions? And thirdly, how are we building capability in non-financial reporting and compliance on GHG emissions, and also on climate risk modelling and quantification? For the COO, I think the key questions are these. So what skills are critical for delivery of decarbonisation activities? Which of those skills could accelerate progress or impede them? How will we staff up to meet transition activities alongside operational delivery? How and when will we redeploy staff across transition activities and then into new skill areas, and particularly in multi-site, multi-country organisations? That's a key consideration. And then thirdly, how are we integrating ESG targets into operational performance management structures and plans without just layering in undue complexity for the operational managers to solve? If we turn to the CHRO, what will our future leaders look like? for a decarbonised future and potentially a new business model? Where will they come from? What attributes of our company culture will accelerate our green transition? What do we need to let go of or build? How will we develop or acquire in-demand critical skills for climate action, free transition and in the future? And how will our employee value proposition attract, retain and motivate our workforce to do that? What role does climate action have in that EVP? And then lastly, just looking at the CMO or commercial officer and looking at it from a sales lens, what type of sales force do we need in a decarbonised future and potentially new business model? Well, we might be working with partners across the value chain. What skills, experience, traits and motivations do our salespeople need? How are we equipping sales and marketing to engage and understand how our customers and downstream end users value decarbonisation alongside performance, quality and price? And then lastly, how do we incentivise sales so that decarbonisation factors are considered in both what and how we sell? So that's a view for those 4 key roles. I think as Nico said, we will circulate after this session an enhanced version of this presentation, and we will give some questions for a number of other executive roles as well. So I'm now going to hand back to Nico, who will introduce our panel session. Nico.
Thanks a lot, Mark. So, so really pleased to introduce you now to our panel today, and Mark and I will ask Magali, James, and Una a few questions on what the people agenda on climate action means for them, based on their experiences being part of the board and the executive committee. And Magali, can I start with you as an introduction? Magali Anderson is the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Holcim, a world leader in sustainable construction, and she's part of the executive committee of the company. Magali, welcome. Can you first maybe give us some context on what the climate action challenge looks like for Holcim in a nutshell, please?
Yes, thank you, Nico. I was just listening to everything that was said before, and I feel super overwhelmed. I'm not sure if I have all the qualities required and the skills required to be a CSO. Now I'm going to go home and say, oh my God. But so the nice thing of being part of a company like Holcim, which is a building material company, is that we are part of that famous hard to abate sector, which I'd rather call full of opportunities sector, because it's a sector where clearly the amount of CO2 emission of our scope 1 and 2 is extremely large. That's the bad news. The good news is that it's under our control because it's our scope 1 and 2. So sometimes I hear my colleagues talking about all the problems with scope 3. We also have scope 3, of course, but in comparison, we can have a huge impact. So I would say, just in a few words, we've had everything that was said before. We've had our net zero commitment. It's been validated by SBTi, both long-term and short-term on the 3 scopes. And we have our short-term, our 2030 target validated for 1.5 degrees. So I could go on, but I guess that was just to put things a little bit in perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of scope 1 and scope 2, which is very typical to the industry, of course. And so what do you see as your biggest challenge in realizing the company's climate action ambitions, and then specifically from the people side, and which is the topic of today?
So the challenge really is not so much on understanding the problem. I think, again, that's a nice thing about being part of the hard to abate sector. I think people see our names in the press on a regular basis. So I think there is an obvious consensus that we are part of companies that if we do not transform ourselves, we will not be part of the solution. And not being part of the solution is never good for a company. So I think the challenge is well understood. how do you get it from the people side? It's really, it's a question a lot to do with governance. So if there's a right tone from the top, do we have the right tools? Do we have the right strategy in place, et cetera, et cetera? And finding the right people. The people have heard for decades that what was really important is what was your bottom line, ultimately. And now we're telling them, well, yes, bottom line remains quite important, but we are emitting a huge number of CO2, and we need to find, because only us can do it. No one else can do it. We are the only one. And if we don't do it, then I think we should be replaced. We will and should be replaced.
Okay,
so yeah, finding the right skills.
Yeah, and really also, so the governance that you know, is something that is really important for you to tackle. Okay, what are your beliefs in how to mobilize the organization and its people around that climate agenda and to deliver to it? And what are you really specifically doing at Holcim today around that?
Yeah, so as I said, you know, the fact that we have a key role to play, I think, is pretty well understood. I don't know anyone who goes to work in the morning thinking, I'm going to damage a bit more that planet today, and I'm happy about it. Or I do hope that no one goes to work with that mentality. So people want to act, they just don't know how, or they are not given the freedom or the empowerment to take that action. And if you are, for example, a country CEO, a regional, so Holcim, we operate in 60 countries. And when we say we have to go to net zero by 2050 with our intermediate targets, it's not just within the European framework of the CO2, for example, it's everywhere. And so I need to convince every single country CEO. The one in Europe, they can understand it because they have this big spade, you know, Damocles spade on their head with their allocation system, so they get that. The other ones, you have to find a way. So there's a few things there. First of all, is managing priorities. When you are an operation person, you are jungling with a huge amount of balls. So which one do you have to keep in the air? And if you know, the CFO of the company is also a French lady, if they have to choose between the objectives that the French lady has sent them and my objective, I'm not sure I will win, in all fairness, because of history, because that's how the DNA of the companies have been built until now. So the work of aligning objectives at the EXCO and being part of the EXCO was absolutely critical to do that. The work of aligning objectives at the EXCO for everybody, putting it part of the long-term incentive, was very important. So people don't have to choose now. Well, I'm not putting my operation people in a situation, which is an impossible situation, really, where we give them from corporate contradicting instruction, hoping that they will sort it out themselves. So the objective was very important. Finding, of course, the turn from the top, but that goes without saying. And then giving them the tools. So once we have the objective set, we decline the roadmap per every single unit. So every single cement plant in the world know exactly what they have to do for the next 3-5 years in detail, a bit less detail later, including CapEx spent, including all of that. So we didn't ignore the CapEx story, you know, again, back to the bottom line, we know we will have to spend CapEx, but find a way to still keep your good bottom line. So we faced it, and we have that roadmap, again, with a bonus system associated to it, which is reviewed both at the EXCO level, but also at the board level on a regular basis. So we put in place a very strong reporting system. So today I have my CO2 results on the 10th of the month of the year to date, and exactly like financial results, with the same accuracy, the same, we treat them exactly like a financial KPI per plant. So I am capable on a monthly basis to tell each plant if they are ahead of their roadmap or not, And it's not necessarily to point fingers, because it's still very early. We have only done that for about a year and a half. So we can understand people need to get used to it. But it's really to find who to support, which ones will have the biggest impact on our overall results, etc., etc. So it's really, so it's one. And I would say maybe to the way, there was interesting comments in the previous presentations of who we interact with. And I like the one about marketing, because we tend to forget a little bit about it. We tend to go, when we are talking climate, into accounting. So I emit 100, I need to go to 0. After 10 years, I will be at 30, 1/3 or whatever. Which is, why not? It's great, but we can have a much bigger impact if we change our business model. If we find a way to incentivize our businesses by producing less instead of producing more. And that's when we start touching, going to a completely different business model. For example, going to 3D printing, where we use way less cement for the same application. But if you don't do that with a change of business model with the entire value chain, it won't work, because you will get everyone going against it and, oh, are you saying we want to sell less cement and make less money? So of course that's going to bring a lot of very negative reactions. So partnering with a marketing team, because now we are talking about selling differently, selling performance, which is not the same client. It's not the procurement guy of the construction company anymore. You are going to the designer. Yeah. And that's really, so again, it's not skills in terms of climate change skills. It's not understanding the impact of climate change, even though it doesn't hurt to understand it. It's really changing the skills of our sales force, of our marketing force, of our technical people, etc., etc. Sorry, it was a bit long, but I thought it deserved a bit of an explanation.
No, I think it's a really interesting example of how sustainability actually really requires your sales and marketing function to transform as well, and requires new skill sets for the people there as well. So do you invest in upskilling the organization in climate action, in the technicalities of that, or is it really more upskilling the people in the sustainability levers of your strategy?
Well, it really depends on the population. Some population we might not be able to upskill them, just because what we are asking from them is so different from their current skills that we might need to bring new people in. That's possible. But a lot of the skills I need are actually skills that exist in-house. When one way to decarbonize is to replace my fossil fuel by waste, for example. So that requires, of course, now when you run your kiln, your cement plant, your thermal output, instead of being very standardized as fossil fuel does, becomes going all over the place, because the waste doesn't have all the same thermal output. This type of skills has got nothing to do with climate change skills. But that's the type of skills we already have in-house, because we have people operating the kilns. We just need to train them to do that. So yes, we are absolutely investing, but again, it's an investment for climate change, but it's also an investment when we manage to run a cement plant with 100% replacement of fossil fuels, which we are already doing in a few plants. We are becoming dependent of energy pricing. So it's good for business, but again, it's a very technical skills, which is not necessarily a pure climate science skill at all. So we invest, but there is really a good ROI or return on investment on this upskilling of our people or training of our people.
Thanks, Magali. So a lot of focus on governance, aligning objectives at the executive level, roadmaps per plant that allow for reporting, and we discussed also the skills agenda and how it affects various areas of the business, like sales and marketing. One final question. What do you, in your role as a CSO, expect from the board in governing and steering the company's climate agenda?
Well, the tone from the top is extremely important. So I interact, we have a committee in Holcim called HSSE, Health, Safety and Sustainability Committee. And I meet them 4 times a year for 2 hours. So it's quite a long interaction time. So it's important that they understand what we are doing. And again, when we are talking about changing the business model, you really want them to get it. Oh, there's an echo. You really want them to get it, to understand what it actually means, and not just, again, it's not just an accounting game. So it's important because it's going to impact the entire company. So the having the support from the board for that is very important. And I also talk to the overall board at least twice a year directly. So it's not just the committee, it's the board. I talk to the governance and nomination and governance committee as well, because when we discuss about changing the bonus system of the company to include sustainability, they need to be fully on board. So I think it's absolutely critical to have the board on board, and having that discussion on regular basis for them to fully support the agenda of the transformation of the company is key. We couldn't do it without the board.
Thank you, Magali, for these insights. I'll hand over to Mark now.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce James Cameron. So James is an award-winning recognised authority in the global climate change movement, qualified barrister with over 30 years experience working as a NAD, a chair, an advisor, and experience of working in legal, academia, non-profit, business and government sectors. Some of his current roles include chair for Crown Agents, a NED for Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust, advisory board member for Heathrow 2.0 and Neste, and then special advisor to systemic pollination and Korn Ferry. So thank you, James. I hope I've given a snapshot of your experience and roles there. You're really keen to get your perspective on the three things you see as most important on this topic. So it's people and climate action in relation to the board.
Well, the first, and thank you very much for all the work done already on this, and the presentations have been full of really useful material. The first thing is to accept that the boards that we have today, in general, are not filled with people who have tested their skills and intuitions on solving these complex environment, development, and sustainability issues. They've reached the top by excelling in other ways. And I think we'd have to admit, bar some exceptions, that on the whole, the boards that we have need to be changed so that there is greater diversity of thinking, not just the diversity of gender and ethnicity, which we also need, but the capacity to solve complex problems in a different way, much as you've set out in the slides to date. So I think that's the first and most obvious point, which is we have to own up to the fact that our boards need change. And that change is largely associated with diversity of thinking. And I would add a kind of desire to solve these problems, because a certain amount of, call it passion, call it a certain commitment, is required, because these problems are hard. They are systemically difficult to resolve. The second point, which you brought out really well already, is that requires some different thinking about how performance is achieved, including through collaboration with others. And that sometimes is very hard to do in highly competitive sectors where there is a well-developed instinct to compete furiously at every possible level with the brand name that's closest to you, or where in fact a lot of the drive for a company is simply to beat the opposition in your sector. And it's very difficult to in any way switch that off in order to collaborate to solve a problem that you both experience, because you're both in that sector and that sector has systemic problems that need resolving for the public good. And that has always been in the private sector a secondary matter after looking after shareholders and staff and the like. And suddenly boards are being required to think differently about that. What are the public goods that I'm in some way responsible for? And how do I address those on my own? Well, often it's not possible to make much a difference on your own. You will need to work with others in the sector and share some knowledge and some experience. And then immediately someone on your board, possibly a general counsel, will say, well, you can't do that because there are competition and antitrust rules that I've got to abide by. And my point there is simply to say, yeah, that very often will be an issue, but you're still going to have to resolve it. You may have to go to the commission and explain why in this sector, it's imperative that you work together with a competitor to find a solution, where the risk that is associated with the investment that needs to be accelerated to make the change in the sector can be borne better by collaboration within the sector, and possibly also with public money, blended with public money. So that's the second thing. Really difficult challenges on how you combine competition and collaboration, and how you emphasize the responsibility that you have, because you have power, to use that power to solve these complex problems. Obviously, for all the 30-odd years of work I've done on climate change, I would elevate that one above all others. And the third area, which is really a kind of adjunct to the first two, is that the climate change problem, and I would say biodiversity and nature loss as well, reveals a really demanding intergenerational equity problem. There is unfairness between the generations. There are generations coming through behind mine who are facing really, really difficult challenges to their future prosperity. And I see myself certainly as in service to those generations that follow behind. And I want to see boards respond to that intergenerational inequity in ways that are really challenging. So that could be by having a representative of that generation on the board, assuming fiduciary responsibility. It could be by using methods that we do in other places, having an advisory council or some non-fiduciary board that feeds directly into the decision-making of the company, and where the CEO is receiving the messages coming from that younger generation. It could be a kind of cell or pod or smaller group that is sent off to solve problems, because frankly, that generation behind us feel the sustainable issue in a way you will never ever feel if you're just intellectualizing it. Right? The desire to solve these problems is immense amongst a younger generation. We've got to find a way of getting that operationalized and into decision-making at the top level of the company, one way or another, true to the culture of that organization. Those would be my three, but there are many others, of course, too.
Maybe just to drill into those a little bit more, James, maybe we start with that last one around the younger generation. So what are you seeing businesses do to involve that younger generation in the workforce, maybe above and beyond what you've talked about at the board level?
Well, I'd like to see more, truthfully. I mean, at the moment, certainly I've, in my own way, I've been trying to put forward names of younger people who I know about the sustainability issue, and who I think are ready. Then maybe they don't think they're ready, but I think they're ready to go on a board and assume the responsibility of doing that. I think you can work with some form of representation, so you can take in advice from a younger generation via a structure that is respected. Ultimately, this will come as an aspect of good constructive leadership, so that the recognition that voice needs to be heard is well organized, well structured, and enhances their career, doesn't put them at risk, because they may well be challenging orthodoxies. And as you say in your slides, or the team slides, you are looking for people who are confident enough to challenge orthodoxies. Just to emphasize the point another way, I do see there being a generational block, a psychological block amongst a generation who, for example, simply can't imagine an energy system without fossil fuels. Can't imagine how you would possibly give up, if you like, the opportunity to use fossil fuels for economic development and growth, who simply can't visualize an energy future without fossil fuels. That's I think, mostly an intellectual block. that a younger generation does not have. They can visualize. It might take time, but they can see ahead a prosperous future, a more sustainable future without fossil fuels. Now, you've got to get that point of view heard. Otherwise, you'll get stuck. You won't find the solutions which are there without that attitudinal shift taking place.
Super. So one last question for you, James. So how can the board help the executive retrain the muscles away from an instinctive competitive posture to collaboration? So you talked a bit about, you know, what's made people successful might be what we need in the future, but what role can the board have to help that retraining?
Yeah, I think that's a retraining muscles is a good phrase. You know, I think a board can set incentives, as we've said. A board can, you know, create new metrics. Some very interesting possibilities are arising now because of our capacity to find different data sets for decision making. You know, you're going to see this also with nature. In the past, you'd have struggled to get nature on a board agenda. Well, now with TNFD and the reporting requirements to the London Stock Exchange, you're going to have to learn how to do scenario planning with natural capital in your calculus, and you're going to have to find people who will be able to speak to that issue, and people have already advanced the idea that there might even be a representative of nature on your board. And it's not such a crazy notion. It may be not that literal, but having someone charged with that responsibility will open up some very interesting questions. And we do this all the time in law. I mean, we have an attorney general. Corporations themselves are legal fictions. We have something in an English legal system called the guardian ad litem. Someone who can't represent themselves in litigation can be represented by an institution. We do this all the time. We could create structures to represent that interest, which in turn is our interest as humans beyond the borders of our company. I think those sorts of structures may be a little experimental at this stage, but worthwhile doing in order to prepare for a change that is definitely on the way. I would add one more thing that perhaps is a dimension that familiar to those companies that are already in well-regulated sectors. But it seems to me that partly because of the climate change issue, partly because of energy security and genuine geopolitical risk, which is increasing, the role of government in this debate is increasing, not decreasing. So you need to have an understanding of the connection between what you do to create private wealth and how you exercise private power in markets, and how public power is exercised specifically in relation to this set of problems: climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, and the circularity issues, which are largely to do with waste and the better use of resources. Increasingly, your board and the advice you take into your board has got to be very good at understanding where power is shifting, and it is shifting towards an increased role for public power in the markets that you will be working within.
Super. Thank you, James. Really insightful. So I'm going to introduce Una Harper now. So Una serves as a chair, non-executive director, trustee and senior advisor on boards. She believes clarity of purpose and values in a boardroom are game changers for achieving corporate objectives driven by a sustainable and responsible culture. And amongst her many current roles, she's an advisory panel member with Walgreens Boots Alliance, non-executive director for the government legal department, chair of the Wisdom of Crowds, and senior advisor to a number of financial and professional services firms boards. And she's also a fellow for Chapter Zero UK. So thank you, Una. So first question to you, what does the board need to do in order to drive action on climate?
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for your own presentation, and Magali and James, because I think you've all set out a number of things the boards need to do. So I thought I'd just concentrate on two that are front of mind for me at the moment, and they are our role as leaders, because I think we're going to have to lean in a bit on this agenda, and also the importance of transition plans, and particularly getting to credible plans. I think from a leadership point of view, we've got 3 time horizons at the moment that are in the boardroom. The first is the immediate need to meet investors' expectations that are really putting pressure on our execs, particularly maybe in the UK more than other places. The second is the 2030, or at least the targets that we are going to need to reach in the shorter term if we're going to have any chance of meeting our climate promises, commitments. And of course, the third is 2050, by which time it's all too late if we didn't do it in 2030 or in the next 5 years. And I think what I've seen in boards over these last decades is that there's really been little discussion of strategy. Strategy has tended to be a 3-year business plan. So those muscles in the boardroom have not really been developed to hold that longer term strategy and vision. Now, nor have the technical skills to develop those strategies. The good news is we've got lots of organisations in this country, the Transition Plans Task Force, and GFANs and others, who are all looking at what transition plans, good transition plans, credible ones, might actually look like, and what might we disclose. And the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force, has been consulting on those, and by later in the year they hope to have developed those for each of the different sectors. And I think that will make our job in the boardroom an awful lot easier. But I do think as a board, I always think the board's governance role is to hold the balance, to keep the short term, the tactical, and balance it with the strategic. We've now got a 25-year vision, target, goal, and we haven't really got time to waste. And for those of us who've been around a while, you know, a lot of these things take time. What gives me comfort is that 10 years ago, we were all talking about risk or cyber or digital or culture, all the new agendas in the boardroom. Where we are today, we've moved a lot, but we've got a lot faster. We've got to move a lot faster if we're to be ready to achieve our climate targets. So that brings me to the transition plans, and I'm mea culpa, you know, I really need to get up to speed with what's being proposed. And Magali's given us a great worked example of where they are and what is involved across every single part of our business. As you said also, Mark, in your brilliant sort of operationalizing all of this, it involves every part of the business. So I think we need to get our heads around what are these transition plans going to look like and need to look like, because we've got to be able to understand them sufficiently to challenge, and to challenge constructively and supportively, which again is our job. But I find you can't do that unless you know what to expect as a good answer. And so Chapter 0, I'm hoping will, you know, just as it did with TCFD and TNFD and everything else, will be our source of lots of good information and inspiration over this next period.
Thank you, really insightful. Second question to you is, what's your view on where climate action should feature in the boardroom?
Yeah, so of course this is not a new question, is it? We had it around risk, we had it around digital, we had it around culture. And of course it's everyone's responsibility in the boardroom. And as you've shown, and as Magali has shown, and as James has also said, when you look across what our transition plans are going to need to cover, we're all in it. We have to have radical collaboration between the board so that we're all contributing from our different perspectives. And as James said, we do need to develop a much more diverse mindset. One of my roles is a public interest non-exec, and that enables me to have that platform to really challenge in that wider public interest. And I would love to have seen all boards have to be required to write public interest commitments, because once you start looking at your public interest strategically from the boardroom, as Kingman recommended, then I think you capture a lot more of these issues. So I don't think climate change can be the purview of one person in the boardroom. It's definitely got to be all of us. But then where and how? And I think we have to recognise, as again you've illustrated, of course, different sectors have different issues, whether it's scope 1 or scope 3 or where it sits. And that means you've got different challenges in the boardroom. But I think increasingly, and certainly on the board where I am, we've decided to involve every subcommittee in their piece of the climate change scenarios. So audit have to take the compliance and risk side. We have a risk and compliance as well. We have a people committee that looks at people, everybody in the organisation, remuneration everywhere, IDE everywhere, culture everywhere, so firm-wide, and then the board itself. So it means the chairs of those committees have to sort of also meet with each other, and then the oversight of the board. I can see at the moment, if you haven't yet got a credible transition plan, you may need to have a subcommittee to focus on that and to have some oversight and coordinating, and maybe it's the chairs of all those subcommittees. It's a lot more work, but we can't hang around. We've got to have some credible plans for the next 5 years and credible targets if we're going to be able to get where we need to be. So I would recognise this is in transition. I'd have dedicated committees where you have to, and then for specific areas, but also make sure every committee, every subcommittee and the board are playing their part.
Thank you. And the last question for you, a little bit the mirror to what Magali talked about. So what's your view on the relationship between the CSO and the board and the CAO? So what needs to be in place for it to be effective?
Well, really, as Magali has shown, and you have as well, I keep saying that, but you've done some great leading up to this. This role that CSOs has is one of enormous influence, and to do it well, they do need the power not just of the CEO, but the board behind them, or at least they'll be much more effective with that. And so it's great to hear from your research that 70%, I think you said, meet with their CEO. I actually think this has to be front and centre of the CEO, the chairman nexus. And I would hope that increasingly they meet together with the CSO, because these issues, these real tensions between the short and long term are going to be ones that the CSO is going to be navigating and finding ways to bring everyone together around, and the CEO and chair really need to be brought in on that discussion. And I think that would be most powerful if they were meeting every quarter. Obviously, once the transition plans are fully embedded, then it probably will be even more important than it is now. So I think that would be my number one addition to what everyone has said. I've got one other thing, Mark, though, from what James was saying. I am a firm believer that yes, we have to have radical collaboration. Yes, we have a huge challenge that because we've got more and more compliance, more rigor and discipline around risk and digital and culture increasingly, it means there is more control from the top. But as James has said, particularly in an organisation like the one I am in, where the modal age is 27, we've got an enormous resource at the most junior end. And every day they are making decisions on the work they do that are going to impact our ability to achieve our goals. And so I do think that we need to move to much more distributed models of decision making. For me, governance is about who makes a decision, where do they make it in the organisation, when and how. And you've seen British Aerospace had to really tackle this after the Wolf report. But you can distribute decision making if the board sets really clear tram lines for how those decisions need to be framed, the core questions. And I've put that into practice myself in a professional service firm with identifying what are the key risks and how much of this can we distribute. And with professional service firms, you've got, like yours, you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of partners making decisions. So I think decision-making frameworks to enable us to distribute decision-making to the most junior, and then enabling a culture where they can challenge and speak up everything that's being done is going to be critical to success.
Thank you, really insightful. So I'm going to hand back to Nico. I know we've kind of used up quite a bit of time, Nico, so.
No problem, Mark. We wanted to spend enough time with our panelists today. So in the meantime, we received quite a lot of questions in the Q&A and the chat box. So what we'll do is we'll regroup the questions and send you a consolidated Q&A report afterwards. For the sake of time, but there's been really some recurring themes in the chat box around a really interesting question around, is there a CSO playbook for transformation? I see Magali saying no, but where do I start? So it was a really challenging question, and a lot of questions on incentives as well, and the role of incentives in driving the climate action ambitions of an organization. Also around culture and skill sets required. So really in the context of the topics that we discussed today. So we will be working on a consolidated report with answers, and that will be made available to all the participants to the webinar. But what we'd like to do still today to close off is get some of your feedback. So we'll launch a short poll to understand what are the topics that you found most interesting today and that you would like to explore more. And the idea of this is that we'll work with Chapter 0 on how we can collaborate more on these topics in the future together. So so you should be seeing the poll now. That with the question is here, like, what are for you the 3 most important people levers for climate action that you would like to know more about? Then I think, Enrique, once we have enough answers, happy for us to have a look at what comes out of this poll. So here we go. So a bit of a mix of all the levers, but with a preference for governance, leadership, and talent, and culture and mindset. So so we'll take that forward in our ongoing discussions with Chapter 0 and see how we can collaborate with all of you around that in the months ahead. As some closing messages to you, and this is what we discussed today, but we really talked about how effective climate action requires key changes to the people agenda, and that we need to look into these 5 key people levers that we talked about today. We talked about your critical role as the board in ensuring organizational transformation, and the need to direct and challenge the executives on people matters as well, and to do that at the functional level as well as the enterprise level. So that is basically what we wanted to share with you today, and I'd like to thank again the panelists today, my colleagues at Chapter 0 for the organization, and we'd like to thank all of you for being with us today, and we wish you success in taking the people side of climate action forward with your boards and executive committees.
Thanks a lot, Nico. Big thanks from our side to all of you for your support in this very informative presentation. Thanks again also to all our members who joined us for the great questions, and we look forward to the next. All topics are important, so work ahead of us to keep answering these questions. Big thanks, everyone. And we'll see you soon at our next events.
Thank you.
Bye.